Welcome to Gatecrashers. We're back with another interview, this time with Steve Foxe, co-creator of Razorblades, editor, and writer extraordinaire. Steve, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
I was very excited to have you. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to get out there as much as I can, and especially since this is the equivalent of conventions for the time being, having fun, and I invested in a podcast mic and everything.
Oh, you have an actual mic. That's awesome. Good to hear.
Well, it's the cheapest Amazon model, so let's not get too crazy.
No, but thank you for coming on. We're very excited to have you. So we do usually start our interviews with a pretty hard-hitting question. So I hope you're ready for it. What's your favorite sandwich?
Ooh, my favorite sandwich is a hot dog. No, that's like the controversial answer, right?
Yeah.
You know what? There's a sandwich shop called Terry's in New York City. It's a small chain of vegan sandwiches, and they have a Thanksgiving sandwich, which is like tofurkey, cranberry, and stuffing. And I never really get it around the holiday season, but it's nice like in the middle of summer when you want to pretend it's winter. So I don't know if it's my favorite sandwich ever, but it's the first one that popped into my head.
Are you vegan or you just prefer that kind of sandwich?
I've been a vegan for about 18 years now.
Wow, good for you.
Yeah, I a little before I read Animal Man for the first time, but it certainly helped reinforce my decision when I read Animal Man for the first time.
I'm actually always excited when people say vegan sandwiches, just because it's out of my normal skill set. So like I want to try every sandwich that someone says. So the vegan ones are always things that I'm more excited for, just because I've never had them.
We've really crossed like the vegan event horizon. There's such good mimicry of all these different products that I'm sure you could get a number of vegan sandwiches where you wouldn't even know that it was vegan upon first bite. Because even McDonald's yesterday announced their new partnership with the Beyond Meat and all of that. So you're gonna have plenty of options soon.
Yeah, I love that. I love seeing more options for things like that, especially because I know it used to be pretty hard to find vegan options at different restaurants.
Yeah, there's a lot of side salads.
So before we get into Razorblades and all that jazz, I'd love to ask you a little bit about editing for comics for things like Razorblades and Department of Truth. I know there's a ton more work about it that people don't really understand. So would you mind explaining a little bit about what an editor does?
Sure. Well, so my first job out of college, I was actually an editor at Random House Children's Books, and I was there for about half a decade. And it took me most of that time to explain to my mom that my job wasn't just to catch spelling mistakes. And in fact, that's a separate position. So when you're an editor for comics, it varies so much book to book, but on a project like Department of Truth, I was brought in before a single page of script was finished and before Martin had drawn anything beyond character designs. So on something like that, I really had a chance to work with James and to work with Martin Simmons, the artist, and help refine James's vision for the book from the ground up. When it comes to something like Razorblades, we approach the stories on such a contextual basis. So we have some creators where, we know them well, we've worked with them before, or we just know what they're capable of, and all we need to do is hear a rough idea and then off they go. And then I have other creators that I work with, from pitches to outlines to script. And then on the art side too, I think the thing about being an editor for comics specifically is that you have to have a certain degree of sequential art literacy, because you're reviewing thumbnails as they come in, you're reviewing pencils as they come in. You have to be able to catch things like double page spreads where the reading order might not be obvious. You have to be able to catch things like poor storytelling choices panel to panel, which is not a reflection on the artist. It's just something that's easy to mix when you're doing dozens of pages a month. You have to be able to catch things like characters in the wrong speaking order in a panel. So your job is kind of to be this like all-seeing eye above the book, to give the creators a break. Because when you're in the thick of writing, when you're in the thick of drawing, it's easy to miss things because you're so close to something. And so then I'm the one who's standing a little farther away and able to see these. And then also just a lot of production work goes into being an editor, and a lot of like project management. On Department of Truth, I'm one of the main liaisons with Image Comics. So I'm doing things like coordinating artist schedules, coordinating our variant cover artists, making sure I write the solicits for the book and get those in on time. Even something like providing all the addresses for comp copies. So it's a little bit of project manager, it's a little bit of story editing, and then there's this extra art component that's exclusive to comics that you're not going to have if you're editing prose.
Holy moly. I never even thought about all the pencils and things like that you'd have to oversee as well, just because that's a lot in itself.
It is, but it's so fun. I mean, when you are a consumer of comic books, you are seeing the finished product. And then sometimes, maybe peeks behind the scenes, but getting to see each step along the way and really understand how things are made, especially for someone like me where I'm pulling double duty as a writer and an editor, getting to see how the sausage is made doesn't demystify the process. It just kind of enriches my understanding of it. So on something like Department of Truth, because James and I are friends, we have a great relationship with Martin, even though he's in the UK, and with Aditya, the letterer, even though he's in India. It kind of feels like we all have the chance to kind of learn from each other as we go along. It sounded like there was a comma, but that was a period.
My mind is kind of blown right now because I never really thought about all the stuff that an editor has to do, especially with like solicits and things like that. So good for you. Like that's awesome.
Well, a fun fact is back when I was I was an intern at Marvel about a decade ago. And the editors handled the solicit text with input from the writers, but the recap pages used to all be written by interns. I don't know if they still pass the buck on that. But there's like a period of a year where all the Ultimate comic recaps were me and all the Hulk comic recaps were me. And actually Donnie Cates was an intern the year after me, and he did doodles for like a Wasp recap page, Ant-Man and the Wasp series. So Donnie's technical first Marvel publication was like uncredited 10 years ago.
Interesting. Yeah, it seems like a lot of people did start in those internships and things like that. I have another friend who started as a Marvel intern, went to DC as an intern, and now is an editor over at DC, which is an interesting path.
Well, Tom Brevoort was famously a Marvel intern years before he became, the editor there.
So with that whole idea of moving from one place to another into comics, as I was reading Razorblades 2 in your intro, you spoke about the illusion of breaking in, but more about the importance of staying in. Do you think projects like this anthology are things that will keep bringing in new talent and new readers so they can try to hone in their skills and try new things to stay in the game?
I think anthologies in general are a great way to get new talent and test them out. You see it at things like DC Comics. They do these quarterly anthologies where you'll often see names for the first time appearing there before they go on to do longer runs elsewhere. There was a time a few years ago when there were a lot of Kickstarter anthologies, and you still see those, not with the same frequency. But that's where some of my first publications were. Razorblades is kind of a different beast. We are certainly open to newer talent, but we're trying to recruit a lot of the names that do already excite us in the horror field. But new readers, certainly. One of the reasons Razorblades has a wide net over the horror world, where we're talking to prose writers, we're recruiting horror illustrators, we're talking to people who are in the indie comics field, is because we do want to cross-pollinate readers. We have Josh Simmons in the second issue, and he is known for these very disturbing and odd fantagraphic books. And you wouldn't necessarily pair him in the same project with James Tynan or with, Marguerite Bennett or whoever else. But we wanted to kind of cross the streams, as it were, to expose, his readers with Jen Bartel's fans, with Trevor Henderson's fans, with, whoever else's fans, and expose people to different facets of horror storytelling. So that's certainly a part of the reason we approach Razorblades the way we did.
I got to say, when I saw that Jen page in issue 2, I was like, I knew she had done something for the issue because it's in the opening. But when I got to it, I was just like kind of taken aback knowing that she does these like beautiful covers. Getting to see something horror was so cool.
Yeah, and my first thought was like, oh, we should have put this on a cover. But we did get to use it for a retailer exclusive, so that will be on a cover. I don't think we can share the details yet, but if folks who want that on a cover will be able to get it.
Good to know. So with all that talent and stuff like that, how did you recruit these people, your writers and things like that?
So James and I came up with the idea for Razorblades when Diamond shut down at the beginning of the year because of the pandemic. A lot of our friends and peers were finding themselves with gigs that they thought they had lined up suddenly on pause or canceled outright. And it wasn't like it was an entirely altruistic idea. It came about because James and I were texting about Department of Truth, and one of his hobbies has been collecting obscure comics on eBay, and he picked up a full run of Taboo, Steve Bissett's horror anthology from the late 80s and early 90s. And he texted me a photo of that at the same time that I was fussing with my bookshelf. And I pulled a couple of my Taboos off the bookshelf and sent him a photo back. And we started just kind of going back and forth about how we wish there was a similar anthology today, where the idea was, cutting edge horror, mixing people from different parts of the industry, really forward thinking instead of nostalgic. And it was kind of perfect timing. A lot of the things that James had planned were a little bit on pause. We were working ahead on Department of Truth, but it hadn't been announced yet. And then we just started asking. We made a dream list of everyone we would want in it for a full year. So before we approached anyone, we kind of planned out what one whole year would look like. And then we just started asking people, and thankfully, 85% were into it right off the bat. And most of that other 15% just couldn't because of scheduling. So we got a really great response. And of course, there are people who he and I consider friends in the first couple issues, and there are people who we've collaborated with before. But we also hit up a lot of people that he and I did not know whatsoever. And we're really excited that just sort of the idea of Razorblades was resonating with other creators, and they were interested in getting in on something like that.
So we spoke of this before the show with how I feel nervous when I have to reach out to people. Reaching out to people that you didn't know for projects that you loved them for. How did that feel? I know you've done it for quite some time.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if there was anyone in particular that made me nervous. Jen Bartel made me nervous, but she was such a dream to work with, and she was really into it. A creator who's in the next issue, who I don't want to reveal yet, she made me very nervous. And she's not necessarily a name you would associate horror. And she was really excited about it. I think we just got such nice responses from everyone. The only thing that made me nervous was, we are a paid anthology, but we have a modest budget. So when we first started reaching out to people, we were like, are we just going to get laughed out of the room? But I think the spirit of the thing really struck a chord with people. And we're in the unique position where we're not reaching out to people to say, hey, can you draw, Kapow Man for me? We're saying, hey, if we let you loose on 4 pages of horror, whatever you want to do, whatever horror means to you, is that something that would interest you? So it kind of feels not that we're recruiting people for assignments so much as we're giving them a platform. And even something like in the first issue, we have one of Michael Walsh's sleep stories. And Michael Walsh has been doing these short, nightmarish cartoons online. But this was the first place it appeared in print and appeared in an anthology. So it's a chance to sort of give a platform to something in this specific form. That kind of undercut the nervousness of reaching out to all these very talented people.
And so with that, so on certain stories, there's different teams that are put together. Do you try to recruit full teams, or do you kind of put people together with other talents, like a colorist with a writer, or an artist with a letterer, so-and-so?
It's been a really fun mix. The way I've explained it before is that James and I came up with a really specific plan so that we could throw the plan out the window. And I think that, once you have a sort of like an idea of what you want to do, then you can be a little more flexible as opportunities come to you. So we have creators who had been dying to work together. For instance, Dan Waters and Lucy Sullivan are in the next issue together, and they had wanted to work together. So here was an opportunity to make that happen. And then we have other creators like Alex Pecknadel and Jason Liu who didn't know each other whatsoever, but I had wanted to work with Jason Liu on something. Alex needed an artist for this serial, and I thought they'd be a good match, and then they really hit it off. So it's been fun to get to kind of roll with the punches as they come here. And when they come in as an attached team and they already have this passion, or we put them together and something magic happens in that, cool results either way.
Yeah, and 10 for 10, both issues have been just stellar for me. Like getting to see and experience different things like prose and just like these short comics is awesome. I don't want to give too much away because I want people to buy it. But that first short in issue 2 with Hickson, who's like one of my favorite artists right now, that blew me away. I loved it. So with Razorblades, I know that James and you just connected, and this thing has just come out of both of your loves. Once you decided to do the thing, what was your next step? Like, did you go to website building? Did you start trying to figure out what it looks like?
We really kind of threw ourselves in the deep end because we didn't announce Razorblades until the first issue was done and on sale digitally. So in one way, we built ourselves a bit of a cushion. If things were going wrong, we needed more time. No one knew it existed yet. But we also knew we wanted to strike while the iron was hot this summer, with things being shut down and books being delayed. So we had a launch goal in mind from the beginning. The first step was reaching out to talent. And the first step of that was reaching out to friends of ours. Ram was one of the first people we asked. Marguerite Bennett was one of the first people we asked, because we kind of needed to build a bench of creators to start from. I think we both had the idea that if our friends were saying no off the bat, then this was not something that was going to be easy to do. But once friends started saying yes and strangers started saying yes, we knew we had something going on. And around the same time, we tapped Dylan Todd, who's also the designer on Department of Truth, to come up with the branding, the logo, the look of the book. And really a key component that we can't overpraise enough was getting Trevor Henderson to do our first. cover is an actor, and he has a big following online, partially because he created a character called Siren Head, who has really taken off and has a unique fandom. And I was just a fan of Trevor's. He tweets about all sorts of different horror. He makes this amazing art. And I reached out to him out of the blue with a proposal to do this cover and kind of come along on this ride with us. And knowing that James and I could get people who weren't in the mainstream comics world already on board, that was a good step for Razorblades. And Trevor's cover kind of set the tone of what we were trying to do for the book. And he also did the reprint cover for the first issue. And he's now got a double page spread in every issue going forward. So Trevor's part of our ongoing cast, our Razorblades family. But that really set the tone. And then one of the things we just got plain lucky on was that when all was said and done for the first issue, we had 72 interior pages, which is divisible by 8. To bind a book, it has to be divisible by signatures. And we hadn't thought ahead for that. We just lucked out. So that was kind of the lucky strike at the very end of the process.
So I've been a big fan of Trevor for a long time. That art is just so unsettling in the best way. When you approached him about doing the cover, did you have anything specific in mind, or it was just like run with it?
Well, we've given all of our creators a lot of leeway. For Trevor, and for listeners who don't know, his handle is Slimy Swamp Ghost on Twitter. One of the things he does so well is he takes photographs and he draws what he calls creeps onto them. So we knew we wanted to do one of those because that's just not something you see in comics a lot. And Razorblades, the subtitle is The Horror Magazine. It's not strictly a magazine. It's not strictly a comic anthology. Clearly, its biggest foot is in the comics world, but we knew we wanted a cover that was instantly going to make us stand out. And so a photo with a monster drawn into it was not going to look like the other cover thumbnails you see in horror comics. And so all we really gave him was do what you do best. And Trevor sent us a bunch of photos before he drew a creep, and we picked our favorite photo, which was a playground for the first issue. And then he drew his creepy little creation on there. I think it's called the Playground Creep on the ad. We had to come up with a name for the copyright. I think it's just called Playground Creeper, which has all sorts of connotations. But yeah, it was just kind of like love at first sight.
Yeah, that when I saw that cover, when you guys announced everything, I was just like, oh my God, is that Trevor?
Yeah. And it was really neat, too, because when we did the reprint, we got him to do the same creature in a new setting, which felt like a fun way to do a variant where it wasn't going to be a radical departure. If you got the first cover, you don't feel cheated out of a monster you might like better. And the second photo is actually the basement of his new house. So he gets to, picture monsters every time he goes downstairs.
Yeah, that's probably a really good thing when you need to do laundry.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've touched on this a couple of times about the magazine having all sorts of storytelling forms, from prose, and especially what's very interesting about it is the interviews. Having those different formats, was that important to you in the creation of this?
I think it was important to us because of that goal I mentioned earlier of kind of bringing people across audiences. If it was 72 pages of comics, I would love that. Many people would love that. But if comics is not already the thing you're going to buy into, then it might not hook you the same way. But if you're a fan of horror art and you see that some of your favorite illustrators have pieces in this, or if you're a fan of horror short stories and you see that there's a short story every issue, or if you're just kind of a fan of the process and you want to see Scott Snyder talk, or you want to see Go Tanabe talk, then there are different entry points than if it was solely comics.
Yeah, I think that variety really sets it apart from a normal comics anthology or something along those lines. And you write as well, so I wanted to chat a little bit about that. What kind of horror inspires you? It's like, what kind of subgenre really gets you excited?
Oh, that's a big question. That's a big question. I will say it's not the most original answer, but Clive Barker was really my entry point into horror. As a kid, I was very afraid of horror. I was always interested in it. I loved, the blockbuster VHS style. I loved the look of the Universal monsters. I loved reading about cryptozoology and myths and legends, but I was afraid to kind of really take the plunge. And Clive Barker's Books of Blood was the first horror series I really read. And then that kind of catapulted me into all other sorts of horror and into finally watching horror movies. I mean, I love restrained horror. I love a sense of dread and terror. I don't really screw with action horror. I'm not a huge fan of like gore for the sake of gore, but I don't know. I mean, any approach done right can be pretty great. I wouldn't say there's any type of horror that just does not whatsoever work for me. But I think especially in the past few years, we have seen what some people have annoyingly called the elevated horror trend. And I think it's kind of a meaningless term, but things like The Witch or The Babadook or It Follows, where there's kind of an intentionality to the scares and to the central metaphor. Those do a lot for me.
Yeah, one that stuck out to me, because you said The Witch, is The Lighthouse, which I don't know if it's considered horror, but it's just a horrifying movie with so many different levels to it.
Yeah, I'm dying to see it. Unfortunately, I missed it in theaters, and I know it's on Amazon Prime, but most of the movies I watch at home are with my boyfriend, and he does like horror, but he's a little more in like the fun horror camp. And so we just haven't had that perfect night where we want to watch some weird aspect ratio of two guys in black and white at a lighthouse.
Yep. I'll be honest, it's going to make it very hard for you to watch the Batman the same way. Once I was watching it, I was like, oh, this is going to be weird for me probably for the rest of my life, because I'm a very big Willem Dafoe fan. And I saw some sides that I wasn't ready for.
Well, actually, if we one of my favorite stories from when I was a Marvel intern was they used to do merchandise sales for the staff. And one day as an intern, I bought a SpiderMan wastebasket, pillow, blanket, umbrella, I think another pillow, just like a whole armful of Spider-Man stuff. And as I was walking back to my dorm, I crossed the street and I locked eyes with Willem Dafoe. And he looked down at what I was carrying and he looked back at me and just like laughed and looked away.
That's actually an incredible interaction.
Yeah, that's kind of my ideal celebrity interaction, where minor acknowledgement and no engagement.
I'm extremely jealous, but yeah, I love that he like looked at your stuff and was like, I'm good. That's also
we just had that acknowledgement.
Was it just like random Spider-Man stuff that you had, or was it movie based?
No, it was the evergreen art. It wasn't even movie based, but I think he saw me realize what I was carrying and put two and two together. But it's one of my treasured New York memories.
What a city. So last night I did get to sit down and finally read your TKO story, Night Train. And I cannot get it out of my mind. I was thinking about it at work today. It's dark. It's real dark. Incredible, but extremely dark. As I was writing up these questions earlier, I was like, do I want to give him a handshake or a hug? Because I don't know what's going on.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you checking that out. And that short is really close to my heart. It's one of my favorite things I've had published so far. I approached it as the Vertigo anthology short story that I'll never get to write now that Vertigo no longer exists. And I did want to stare that bleakness in the face. I think that there is an impulse and it'll have that release valve to sort of let the tension out. And I think one of the beautiful things about short stories is that you don't have to do that. If you're reading a 300-page novel, or if you're reading a 12-page comic or a 12-issue comic series, you can't really have full bleakness the whole time without desensitizing your reader or just bumming them out. But in this compact form, I felt like I could really go for the dark edge. And the original version was actually darker. And my TKO editor, Sebastian Gerner, had some good advice on how to pull back from a full nihilism.
So I do want to get into the length of it a little bit. Do you think a story like this would be as impactful if you had more bandwidth to tell it, or do you think you would have probably lost it to the nihilism, as you said?
Yeah, so Night Train is 12 pages. The TKO shorts are all between like 12 and 15 pages, and I really do love the short format. I am sure there are versions of the same story that I could have told at a longer length to expand on things here and there, but I do think there's something that works really nicely about getting right to it. In the prose world, there's such a tradition of horror short stories. And in the comic world, you do have these anthologies that have appeared every couple of years. But I think any opportunity to have that short contained story and to leave the reader with some tantalizing questions and to kind of start where it needs to start and end where it needs to end is nice, especially because, I won't name names, but you can look at a number of different horror series and comics that launch very scary, very tense. And as they go, they kind of end up layering in enough elements that you lose the horror aspect and it becomes more of a fantasy or more of an action adventure, because it can be hard to sustain that kind of tone month after month after month.
Yeah, I fully agree. I won't name names either, but that does, a lot of horror series do lose it after a while, because in a continuous series, as you can only keep it quiet and like low for so long, you have to keep ramping up to keep people reading. But
right. And I don't begrudge the creators who are able to keep those stories going for a long time, but there's a reason a lot of horror movies, the sweet spot is 90 minutes. You don't have a lot of 3-hour horror movies because it's hard to keep that sort of like tight violin string tension the whole time.
Yeah. And so before we do move on to some of your other work, I did, if you don't mind, a little bit of spoilers. What inspired the conductor? Like where did you come from with that character?
Yeah, so for readers who aren't familiar with Night Train, it's a story of a 10-year-old boy whose family lives under an elevated railroad track, and his parents have a new baby, and the baby is moved into his room, and between the railroad track and the screaming baby, he becomes increasingly deprived of sleep, and he sees or thinks he sees a conductor who arrives on the elevated railroad track over his apartment, offering to take the baby, to give the baby a chance to sleep and give him a chance to rest as well. And the genesis of that story was twofold. I'm 30 and I'm gay, and my partner and I have no goals to ever have kids, but some of my friends are now having babies of their own, and they're all happy and taken care of, but it still got me thinking about the sacrifices you make when you have a child and the responsibilities you have when you have a child, especially in the world we live in now. And then the other part of it is a lot more mundane, which is that I live in Astoria, which is a neighborhood of Queens, and we have an elevated subway track, and we also have the Long Island Railroad cuts through, and that's elevated well above the apartment buildings. And I love to just run around my neighborhood, and I get a lot of my inspiration while I'm running, either from things I see or just things that start to connect in my brain when I can't look at my phone, when I can't look at a computer. And so just seeing those elevated railroad tracks all of the time and thinking about what it must be like to live right underneath them, how much do you hear, how much does it shake the building? It was just a chance of like two things coming together to give me this story.
Interesting.
And a fun random fact is that the particular above ground railroad I'm thinking of, if you know the show Evil on CBS, it actually films in a house right under that. So no connection, and they haven't done anything like this, thankfully. But the evil house is situated right under the same railroad that inspired Night Train.
Huh, interesting. Yeah, kids seem like a huge responsibility. And their hands are always sticky, so like I'm good for now. Like I don't.
Yeah, not a fan. I'll write for them, but I don't need them myself.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about horror, so I do want to switch from horror to horny, and let's talk about cheater code. Did I say that right? Is that how you would say it?
No, you can just say cheater code, but
I'm gonna put the gap there. Cheater code.
Okay.
So the cover alone is just filled with a bunch of nerdy illusions. What inspired this story, and are you actually a gamer yourself? Like, what's going on there?
Yeah, so Cheater Code is a full-length 18-plus erotica graphic novel released by Oni Press by their imprint Limerence Press, which does inclusive erotica and sex education comics. I got the opportunity to pitch for them almost 4 years ago now. My friend Teenie Howard, who works on the X-Men books at Marvel, she was writing Rick and Morty at the time with Ari Yarwood, who was an editor at Oni Press. She's since left the company. But Ari created Limerence. It was really her baby. And they weren't getting a lot of pitches from queer men. And there's some amazing male-male erotica created by people who don't identify as men. But I think that there's also something to be said for the authenticity of like the lived experience of being a man who has sex with men. So Cheater Code was a little bit inspired by a breakup I had and how I got over it, and also a lot of bit inspired by a lifelong love of video games. I can't say I'm the world's biggest gamer now just because I don't make as much time for it as I used to, but certainly through to my college years, I was nearly as plugged into games as I was to comics. I think once you hit your 20s, you kind of got to pick a lane and stay in it. And for me, that's comics. I play a lot of Overwatch because it's kind of my like turn off my brain game. But my biggest love in games is more story-driven games, and I just don't have as much time for that as I used to have. So Cheater Code was a nice way to pay tribute to some of my favorite series like Elder Scrolls. There's some Mass Effect in there, platforming video games, Silent Hill, and just all the archetypes that we know and love about the gaming world. And I really got lucky with the artist Daryl Toe, who's credited as DAZ on the book. We all used slight pen names. But Daryl is a big gamer. And there's always a lot of discussion on how much influence artists have over a story. And the whole second chapter, the first chapter where the protagonist is in the video game world, is set in like a Silent Hill, Resident Evil inspired world. And that was all Daryl's suggestion. So Daryl had a lot of impact on the book. And it was such a boon to get to work with someone who already understood the language of video games and the visual language of video games. Because if I had to explain each and every reference as we went along, that book just would have become such a slog. But Daryl and I had that shared language from the get-go.
Well, I'm glad you had a good partner on that. That chapter sounds very exciting. And I totally agree about after your 20s, it's kind of harder to play games. I would give a lot to just be able to have a weekend where I can sit down and just play the Elder Scrolls Oblivion all weekend.
Oh, yeah. I booked probably like 180 hours on that game when it came out.
Yep.
And, now I would be lucky to spread that out across 2 years.
Yeah, I would love to go back to just be able to play that game all day.
Yeah, I'd like snow days. Adults should have snow days. But now kids aren't even going to have snow days because they're just going to go to Zoom.
Yeah, my partner is a teacher, and we were talking about that because they can do online learning now. It's like, oh, what happens if like the like you could just do an all-9 day if it snows. That's
Yep.
going to be awful. The kids will never understand that classic film Snow Day. It's going to be bad.
That's going to become a historical artifact.
Yeah, that's a big one. That's like Citizen Kane. So you did. I had a question about what inspired the story with the breakup and things like that, but I do want to get a little bit more into the nuances of writing a romantic story rather than something horror or things like that. How did you approach writing a romantic story in general, and how much of your own experience kind of bled into that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't think of Razorblades so much as a romance as sort of a horny comedy in a lot of ways, because it opens with the main character finding out that his long-term partner has been cheating on him. And so it's really more about, it's not about Kennedy finding new love, it's about Kennedy learning to love himself. And that is a little cliche when you put it that simply, but I think part of a breakup, especially when you've been with someone for several years, is really figuring out who you are in the absence of them and figuring out what your identity is removed from your other half. All the terms we use to describe romantic partners, there's a real tethered sense, and it's really like, oh, you complete me. You're my other half. So a breakup can feel like losing part of yourself. And in Kennedy's case, he kind of finds himself by having sex with lots of video game characters, which is not a very common experience, but getting back out on the market is. So for me, I was kind of putting my own experience with having fun and exploring a different side of myself after a breakup and transposing that to this love of video games and this, frankly ridiculous premise, and giving Kennedy a chance to find himself both through sex and flirtation and through one of his main hobbies, especially because in the book, Kennedy's hobby of playing video games is kind of attacked by his partner, who makes it out to be one of the things that dragged Kennedy away from him. So to me, it was a way of empowering Kennedy that he could find himself in these hobbies that his partner had criticized. And as far as how I approach that differently from horror, Cheater Code I actually wrote a couple of years ago now, and it took a little while to come out, and it even got delayed again because of the pandemic. But it was a very learn-as-I-go project, and I was lucky to have someone like Daryl who had more experience than I did when I got started. But I think because I was writing from such a personal space, and I was also channeling something I loved so much, video games, not the sexy part, it flowed pretty easily. And we also have a bit of an episodic structure because he moves from video game to video game and we explore these different worlds. I think with horror, it depends on what kind of horror you're doing, but it is driven by this sort of guillotine that's going to drop over your characters at some point. And with something with like Cheater Code is more about building Kennedy back up than having something that's going to drop on him. The guillotine drops in the opening scene when he catches his partner cheating on him. And the rest of it is about the sense of finding himself and the sense of recovery and also just fun. There are a lot of fun video game allusions throughout the book.
I'm very excited to read it.
Don't read it in public.
Reading comics is hard sometimes in public. I was on the train reading the new Teen Titans, and Starfire makes it kind of hard to read on the train. I'll tell you what. Yeah,
I do a lot of reading on the subway, and as a gay man, I don't always think about the sexualized aspect first and foremost because it's not titillating to me personally. But there are certainly times where I turn the page and I realize, oh, this is getting me some weird looks from anyone standing over my shoulder right now.
Oh, okay. So we talked this about a little bit earlier because I've realized that not everyone knows what this is. If you had a Rube Goldberg machine, what would it do?
So, do you normally have people explain the whole machine or just what it would ultimately do?
Just what it would do. If you have ideas on how it happens, I am more than happy to listen to them.
Well, my boyfriend and I have lived together for about a year and a half, and we had a roommate who has since moved out. But after he moved out, we did a lot of cleaning and reorganizing, and things that we have too many of include Funko Pops, particularly Overwatch ones, books. I have too many books, which I think is a common writer problem. And he has so many clothes because he works in fashion. So I would like to think that it would be this strange contraption that involved a lot of Funko Pop, probably the heads tipping them over, a lot of books as dominoes, and maybe some expensive sweaters tied together. But ultimately, it would just pet our dog. And she would be terrified of it because she doesn't like noise or things looming over her. But it would pet her nonetheless. She might pee a little bit, and then she'd come running to us.
Follow-up question to that. Do you mind if I ask what kind of dog?
She's a little mutt. She is potentially part like miniature pinscher or chihuahua. Her name is Cora. I had never seen the cartoon before this summer. My boyfriend named her before we got together, but she's a 4-year-old. I always say she's medium. She's not like small, but she's not like a medium-sized dog. She's about 20 pounds. And she loves bandanas and little sweaters. When you're the dog child of gay dads, you get lots of clothes.
My girlfriend does the same thing. She dresses up our dog in these outfits, and I've grown up with dogs my entire life. Never once has a dog liked clothes until Dinah. She has little sweaters, and she gets mad if I take them off her. And I'm like, "What is your problem?" And she's like a big, like a 50-pound dog. It's she's wild.
Yeah, as soon as I get the clothing out, Cora will like lift her paw up like she knows where it's going. It keeps her nice and cozy.
Well, Steve, I want to thank you for coming on. Where can people find you?
People can find me at Steve_Foxe, Foxe, on Twitter and Instagram. Instagram will mostly be pictures of my dog, but Twitter will be comic relevant information. They can also find me at stevefox.com, where I put all the books that I am working on. And you can also find Razorblades at readrazorblades.com or at readrazorblades, READ, because you're reading it, on Instagram and on Twitter.
I didn't know there was an Instagram. I'll have to go follow that one. You can find us at GateCrashersPod on Twitter and Instagram now. Before they weren't the same, but now they are. And we'll catch you in 2 weeks.